Welcome to the last Thursday of the MOVEVO Move Days 2025. So far, you have already shown a great deal of endurance. That's exactly what today is all about. And I'll take you on a journey of endurance. Where endurance comes from, why we as humans are made for endurance, how endurance and longevity are related to each other, and how endurance affects our health. Before we get into it, a short message from our Move Days partner, Panaceo.
Hello, my name is Teresa Omann and I am Head of Sports Marketing at Panaceo. Movement, regeneration and a healthy lifestyle are the key to success in sports and in our daily work. Panaceo Sport is an official partner of MOVEVO Move Days because we share a common goal: to motivate people to consciously deal with their health and body. Our sports products support not only athletes, but also anyone who wants to improve their performance, optimize their recovery, and strengthen their immune system. We all know that striking the right balance between performance and regeneration can make all the difference in every situation in life, and that consciously taking breaks at work is essential to sustainably increasing concentration and productivity. Together with MOVEVO, we are setting an example for more movement and better health in all areas of life.
Longevity through endurance. Proper endurance training for better health and increased performance. Longevity for those who are not yet familiar with the term. Longevity is all the rage. You read about it everywhere. How do you age healthily? How do you age at all? What does old age look like? And endurance, especially maximum oxygen intake, plays a central role in this. And that is precisely the topic of today's talk. How does endurance training help us to age healthily? If we take a look at evolution, we see that we have come a very, very long way over millions of years. We started out as hunter-gatherers, walking and running more than 15 kilometers a day, and of course, training our cardiovascular system in the process. This has become a prerequisite for our development. Without this movement, we would not be what we are today. MOVEVO, our name, reflects this as well. Movement in the sense of evolution. This is what MOVEVO stands for: move and evolution. So we have moved a lot over millions of years. It was only with the increasing industrialization that our lifestyle changed significantly, especially in the last 60 years. To survive, we no longer had to move. We no longer had to do physical work. Many of us now have a sedentary job and get very little exercise, often not even 1,000 steps a day, especially when working from home. The pandemic has shown that people working from home move significantly less than in their normal daily routine. So over the last 60 years, we have developed certain problems that go against our nature, or where we develop against our nature. And whenever we develop in a way that goes against our nature, illness is never far away. Our environment shapes us. I have already mentioned that our modern lifestyle shapes us. We have made it a habit to let our comfort get in the way of our everyday lives. We prefer to take the escalator rather than the stairs, even if our destination is the gym, where we might consciously exercise. But unconscious movement, everyday movement, that is increasingly disappearing. Of course, it starts from an early age. If we take a quick look at the data to get a sense of the dramatic nature of this situation, then, of course, life expectancy is a very strong indicator. It is now 83 or 84 years in the modern Western world. Other countries are catching up here too. Increasing prosperity also leads to increasing life expectancy, but the healthy years of life do not increase at the same rate. In Austria, in particular, we are even lagging behind in terms of healthy years of life in an OECD comparison. 58 for women, 59 for men. Healthy years of life. We then spend an average of 20 to 30 years in illness. And I believe that is something very few of us want. Health is important to everyone, especially when it can no longer be enjoyed to the full. Other countries are doing better, especially the Scandinavian countries again, where exercise is still an essential part of everyday life. Let's take a quick look at the cardiovascular data, because of course it is inextricably linked to endurance performance. First and foremost, the number one cause of death in the modern Western world, cardiovascular disease. More than 45% of deaths are due to cardiovascular disease. Of course, we have to die of something. That is also the nature of life. But it doesn't have to be cardiovascular disease because it depends so much on our lifestyle. This includes coronary heart disease, heart attack, stroke, all of which, of course, also affect our vascular and heart health. Of course, there are certain risk factors associated with this. Of course, being overweight is one of them. Obesity has increased by 300% in the modern world over the last 60 years. It's an incredible figure when you think about it. High blood pressure, also an expression of the elasticity of our blood vessels. If the blood vessels are brittle, if they are no longer as elastic, then the heart has to beat harder and always work against resistance. Of course, this is also a risk factor for cardiovascular disease and one of the most important risk factors for type 2 diabetes, which is often accompanied by poor heart health. So there are already a lot of numbers that make us think and where we would like to take a closer look at endurance. First of all, there is the maximum oxygen uptake. This is the gross criterion of the upper performance capacity, as it is called in sports science. Many people are now familiar with this value of VO2 max, whether from sports watches, from the media, or of course, especially if you do endurance sports, you come across this value, but often it is not entirely clear what it actually means. And there is an enormous amount behind it. Behind this, the V2 max is the maximum oxygen uptake that a person can absorb, transport to the cells, and ultimately utilize during exertion. It is measured in milliliters per minute per kilogram. What does that mean in detail? Absorption, oxygen absorption, naturally occurs through the lungs. This also expresses the capacity of the lungs and the load. The air, and of course oxygen, also goes to the heart, from the lungs to the heart. Then the oxygen is transported throughout the body, via the heart, via the aorta. Of course, there is the ejection volume and also the vascular elasticity. The elasticity, which I've already mentioned, is of course also crucial for how well we can supply the periphery, i.e. the legs, arms, and muscles in these areas with oxygen. And then, of course, the oxygen molecule must also enter the muscles, into the muscle cell, to produce energy there. Here too, utilization plays an important role. That is, recording, transporting, and utilizing. All of this is represented by a number. And this number is decisive for our performance and, as we now know, for our health. There are always some exciting figures doing the rounds. Of course, top athletes also regularly look at this maximum oxygen uptake. Here you can see an athlete doing a step test, a spiroergometry test, where you can then determine this value as accurately as possible. So actually the most accurate method of determining the maximum oxygen uptake is a stress test on a treadmill and yes, top endurance athletes can achieve up to 80 milliliters per minute per kilogram. Take Miguel Indurain, for example, who won the Tour de France several times. Measurements of over 90 have also been taken, apparently by Björn Deli, one of the most successful cross-country skiers of all time. So there are also incredible values, and it simply shows this adaptability, this enormous adaptability of humans. At the other end of the scale, of course, are cardiovascular patients who have limited cardiac output and limited oxygen utilization, and who move at a rate of less than 20 milliliters per minute per kilogram. These are, of course, significant differences, and there is a great deal of space in between. And we are also looking at this place now because, of course, it also affects us directly. We have also looked at it a little from a health perspective. The fact that the VO2 max is important for sports was known very early on. All these data on the health effects of a high VO2 max are not that old at all. These studies have become particularly popular in the 2000s and in the last 10 years, and are of course also shaping this longevity trend, where it has already been recognized that exercise and endurance are important for healthy aging. What else do these studies show? I won't go too much into depth into the scientific world, but we'll take a few facts with us. Reduction of mortality risk 80% with a high VO2 max. 80%. This means that the benefit of a high VO2 max is higher than that of, for example, not smoking, avoiding heart disease, or type 2 diabetes. It is the VO2 max that has the greatest influence on our mortality risk. You have to keep that in mind. I don't think many people realize that. Of course, long-term studies have also been carried out with many hundreds of thousands of subjects, and it has been seen how a low VO2 max then affects how a high VO2 max affects. And it has been found that you really have a fourfold increased risk if you are in the least fit area, which is 20 milliliters. So the VO2 max maximum oxygen uptake is 100% dependent on our lifestyle. Whether it's hiking, mountaineering, ski touring in particular, skiing not so much, climbing stairs, taking steps. All of this naturally challenges our cardiovascular system and is important for it to be able to develop. And if these everyday movements and also the sport are no longer done, then the VO2 max follows a great law. Use it or lose it. If we do not challenge a system in the body, then it breaks down. It breaks it down and loses efficiency, and thus we also lose significantly in health. A great myth is then also circulating in the world, because of course it has somehow been noticed that VO2 max decreases with age, and for a long time it was assumed that it was because of restrictions. And because, of course, certain illnesses are more prevalent in old age, there are also statistical correlations. It is assumed that with every decade of life, the VO2 max decreases by 10%. And then at some point, certain activities are simply no longer possible. These are, for example, climbing stairs or carrying heavy bags from the shops home, which also require a certain oxygen uptake. If this can no longer be achieved, then it is extremely exhausting and the activity can no longer be performed. But now we know that maximum oxygen intake is also adaptable to what we do throughout the day. I have supervised a large number of subjects who could significantly increase their oxygen intake from 30 to 40 milliliters, for example. And that, of course, is also a sign that we have a great deal of control over how we shape our health. Let's take a look at the data. I went to the University of Sports in Graz, where I had a great professor in performance diagnostics and learned an enormous amount and really immersed myself in the subject. I was interested in it from the very beginning. And somehow the conversation turned to, yes, as a healthy young adult in your mid-20s, it's normal for a male person to have an oxygen intake between 40 and 45. Well, every young adult should be able to achieve that. That was my mindset. I came from a background of elite sport. Of course, we did spiroergometry tests regularly, and it was the norm to get a score of over 50. Of course, a specific training is also needed for that. It's no longer possible just through everyday activity. Then I came to Altasse as the sports science director at Weivemeier and did metabolic analyses on thousands of people there. I was still young and inexperienced back then, so I tested these people. We always determined the maximum oxygen intake, and suddenly there was no one who made it over 30. I thought the machine was broken. Then I grabbed my colleague, who was actively doing triathlons back then. It was also at 58. I realized, okay, the device is not broken, it must be something else. And then I looked into it. In sports, you also live in this bubble far away from reality, and there were really hardly any people who landed over 30 milliliters per minute per kilogram. and regardless of whether we are looking at the male or female norm values. If we are under 30, we are definitely in the bad, even previously bad range. And of course, that goes hand in hand with a high risk. If you are a young person, you are only at 30 and then your oxygen uptake continues to decrease, then you quickly find yourself in this area where cardiovascular disease is very, very risky and where you simply can no longer do certain wonderful activities of normal everyday life, where a hike up a mountain or the summit experience then represents a huge hurdle, and so you can no longer experience many things. With that in mind, let's take a look at this data. I think it's really interesting for many people to see an analysis like this, to perhaps see where they fit in themselves or to be inspired to do an analysis like this themselves. We see a protocol of a step test here, test on the treadmill. On the lower axis, horizontal axis, we see the kmh. The test started at 5 km/h. Every minute, 1 km/h was increased. At 15, it was then over, and then there was a recovery phase. On the vertical y-axis, we see the energy consumption and also the heart rate. We are already interested in that, but we need to understand everything in detail. Let's take a quick look at this energy consumption. We have the green curve, which is the fat metabolism, and the red curve, which is the carbohydrate metabolism. Green fat metabolism. The ideal situation would be that if you exercise moderately, at moderate and low intensity, the body is actually in fat metabolism all the time. This myth that we have to exercise for 20 minutes to get into fat metabolism, that is also part of the story. We should be metabolizing fat all day long. Fat is our most powerful, largest energy source and energy store, and we should be drawing on it all day long. Whenever we consume carbohydrates, consuming carbohydrates too early will make us hungry. And of course, this also applies to endurance sports. So it makes sense to spend the majority of this low intensity phase in the fat metabolism. And that's what happens here. At some point, there is a physiological change where the body needs more energy and can no longer get it from fats alone. And then the green curve drops and the carbohydrate stores are used. We see this intersection between the green and red curves here. What happens next? More and more carbohydrates are added, fewer and fewer fats can contribute, until there is this point where only carbohydrates take over. The red curve is hidden behind the blue one, which represents the total energy demand, and the green curve is actually zero. And at some point, so much lactic acid in the muscles, at some point the strain is so high that we have to stop the strain. And it is precisely at this point that we reach our maximum oxygen intake. At the highest performance we can deliver, the cardiovascular system has to work at full capacity to supply the working muscles with oxygen. So here in the range between 14 and 15 km/h, we reach the maximum oxygen uptake. And with these test subjects, it was 45 milliliters minute per kilogram. And we see in brackets that this test subject was 63 years old, so it was definitely a top performance for this age, absolutely in the top category. Few people are still so fit at that age. That would be an ideal, I would say. Unfortunately, I have only seen very, very few of them. Why? Because there is a second image in addition to the maximum oxygen uptake, namely the black hole of training intensity. We are running too fast. If you are out and about in Vienna, Wiener Prater, or on the running trails in Austria, you will see a lot of people running, their tongues hanging out, their heads bright red and not really looking enjoyable. We run too fast. We primarily move in this yellow zone where we can run well for maybe 3/4 of an hour to an hour, where we mainly burn carbohydrates. But when the carbohydrate stores are empty, then that's it for the intensity, and then we have to stop the workout. Afterwards, we are hungry and often have cravings. Training success is also difficult to achieve. You always run the same lap. Time is more or less standing still. you are somewhere in this comfort zone. And this yellow zone is often referred to as the black hole of training intensity. That means we have to leave this zone to become more powerful, to train our endurance, and to improve our VO2 max. It happens in this development zone. We will come to this in more detail, but also in the low intensity zone. Therefore, we are running too fast. This is where the big secret happens, the fabled zone 2 of peak endurance. Peak endurance athletes spend 80% of their training time in this low intensity. Of course, they have so much potential in this zone that it looks extremely fast to us, to a layman, of course, how he moves, but for him it is actually only a little strain. They can still breathe through their nose. They can still talk while running. The heart rate is in a very low range. The personal stress level is perhaps at 3 or 4 out of 10 on the personal scale. This is where basic endurance is built. This is where we strengthen our resilience. This is where we break down stress hormones and can also find balance for ourselves. If we have a very stressful job, if we have a lot on our minds, then it is even more important to push into zone 2 and spend a lot of time there. And then we just increase our resilience and our ability to recover. And at the end of the day, this is crucial for top athletes to be able to do such high volumes and also to be able to sustain the highest intensities to recover quickly when things get more intense. And that is precisely the big difference. Amateur athletes only spend an average of 20% in this zone, are always moving too fast, and are predominantly in carbohydrate metabolism. Let's take a quick look at this in a top athlete. It's the same picture. The data has changed a bit. This test started at 8 kmh and ended at 26. So this is a world-class top endurance athlete. This athlete is metabolizing fat up to 18 kmh. While 90% of runners have already reached their limit at this point, top athletes are still metabolizing fat. The same can be seen in top cyclists, rowers, and in all endurance sports. At loads that we as laymen can no longer sustain, they are still in the green zone, in this zone 2, in the fat metabolism. It's also incredible how adaptable the human body is. At some point, the fat metabolism also collapses physiologically, and performance can only be maintained with carbohydrates, but only in an area above 20 km/h. This is the only way to explain how the half marathon can be run in under an hour, and how the marathon might soon be run in under 2 hours, because carbohydrates are not constantly being consumed. That would be the ideal, the optimal image. You can also learn a lot from competitive sports. So let's take a look at the image of an untrained person. Here is the data. The test was started at a very, very slow walking speed at 3.5 km/h. This is slow walking and was then increased in smaller increments, smaller steps, and at 8.9 km/h, i.e. moderate relaxed running, it actually ended. The heart rate went up immediately. And if we compare the size of the green zone for the top athlete, we see the exact opposite picture. The green zone is very, very narrow. As soon as the person starts moving, they are actually using fat metabolism. This also drops quickly. And actually, as soon as this person moves, they mainly consume carbohydrates, which of course is also associated with carbohydrate consumption, which of course is also associated with hunger for carbohydrates after a workout. The person will tire more quickly and become exhausted faster. And as soon as the person starts running, which usually happens between 6 and 6.5 km/h, which is our running speed, the person is actually already in the red zone. So the strain will no longer be maintained for quite so long. Here it is surprisingly long anyway. The person seems to be good at torturing themselves, but their basic endurance is not particularly well developed. This person had a maximum oxygen uptake of 24, which is already in the vicinity of the risk area for cardiovascular disease. They were 35 years old, and had a sedentary low movement lifestyle. Unfortunately, this picture is no longer an exception. It has become the rule. And from that point of view, such a person is, of course, on the one hand, characterized by an increased maximum oxygen uptake. Benefit, but of course also specifically from a greater degree of this green zone. And this green zone, I have already characterized it earlier. This is the area where we have a personal sense of relief from 3 to 4, where we can still breathe through our noses, where we can perhaps still speak, at least in paragraphs, where we can actually maintain a load for several hours. I have before, since our runner from Mexico in the picture, from the Tarahumara people who spend hours on the move, running hundreds of kilometers from one place to the next, also visiting relatives. So people who really live up to this name, born to run, whether women, children, or men, everyone is constantly on the move. Then they invited Dara Omara to ultra runs in America, and suddenly they all ended up in the top spots without ever to have had sports shoes, without ever having done a sports science examination. They have lived exactly what our evolutionary heritage is, and they just spend. Such achievements are only possible if you move in this zone too, and the positive thing is that you can start again at any time. This zone will gradually widen. The important thing is not to drive too fast to prevent this positive effect from happening. Let's summarize, we are coming to the end. So, a major goal of proper endurance training is to broaden zone 2, shown here as the green zone. This is our evolutionary heritage. Yes, and collecting. We have been moving for hours, 6 to 8 hours a day, throughout our evolutionary history, spending a great deal of time in this area. That was the alternation between moderate running and walking, how we hunted, how we became the most enduring mammal. No animal in the world beats us in the discipline of endurance. We are not the fastest, we are not the strongest, but in endurance we are superior to very, very many, in fact to all. This is how we hunted and survived. So this long-term method at a low intensity where you can still breathe through your nose is perhaps the most important marker I can give you. When you go hiking, when you go ski touring, when you are out and about, try breathing through your nose and you will quickly realize that the usual pace is perhaps a little too fast for you. Switch back, move in zone 2. Zone 2 is the only area where the more, the better really applies. Here, every step and every single minute contributes to a positive effect. You can't do enough. This does not apply to all training, not to all training. This does not apply to strength training, and this does not apply in particular to this red zone, the improvement of VO2 max, the interval method. The rule of thumb I can give you here is make sure you do high intensity exercise once a week. This could be a team sport, ice hockey, football, anything you enjoy. The natural interval character is part of the game, part of the culture of the game. You walk a bit faster, then you take a few slower steps again. You are constantly alternating, constantly in the fight or flight mode that this is supposed to simulate. If you are not active in competitive sports, but would rather take your first steps in endurance training, then of course you can do that too. Alternating between running and walking is ideal. Pedal harder or easier, even with an e-bike. Switch the motor off or on. There are so many ways to incorporate this into your activity. Just 1 hour of this per week would have an enormous positive effect on your maximum oxygen intake. Maximum oxygen uptake is important for our health as a marker for mortality, as we have seen, and of course to improve your performance. When this whole image starts to move, when this green zone gets wider, When you notice that you can suddenly run faster, that this whole image shifts to the right, then you have certainly improved your VO2 max. If you want to know exactly, then I would recommend a spiroergometry test in a performance diagnostics laboratory, of course. That way, you get the results in black and white. The watches are now giving very good indications they are no longer far off. Of course, you can also use them to orientate yourself and notice your improvements. If you want to know more, you will learn more. There will also be special episodes on endurance training in our current podcast, Wunderpille Bewegung. We will go into some of them already, and I want us to go into them much deeper. And otherwise, I hope you have a few more good sessions at Move Days 2025. We are on the home straight. Move Days is over tomorrow, and I hope you have achieved more with us.